Can I call the Freds up? When we were getting ready, that was our name for this panel, the Freds. I'm going to have them introduce themselves here in 1 second. But one thing I wanted to draw your attention to is that word cloud that was up there just a moment ago. And it was interesting because when we first wrote the book, after we had a few martinis at Nancy's house, the Investing in What Works book, it really got us thinking about two themes came out of this book that were also in that word cloud, which were data and funding, right? And what that led us to do was write a book about data and funding. So we're all in sync on this. We think these are really important ideas. I want to just draw attention to the fact Naomi Citron's in here, I think. Naomi, raise your hand. She is the editor of this book, What Counts? Harnessing Data for America's Communities. And it's excellent and really tackles a lot of these issues that are woven through this book, Investing in Results. We had a book in the middle that I wouldn't have done except for the fact that Andrea Levere told me to do it, and you do what Andrea tells you to do. And it's called What It's Worth, Strengthening the Financial Futures of Families, Communities, and the Nation. And I just didn't understand enough about the world of household financial well-being. But if you care about any of the issues that we care about, whether it's health, education, public safety, you have to go through the way station of household financial well-being to get there. It is really integral to that, any strategy you have. So this is a book all on those strategies. It's really excellent, and I think it really sort of draws attention to how this explosion of creativity is happening in that sector. So you have essays in here where the one public health professor is quoting one of his interviewees who says, "If you want to help lower my blood pressure, help me pay my electrical bill." Another one that I find so powerful is, oh, I just forgot that one. So sorry, I'll come back to that. But it's this idea that you have to be, the idea that the #1 leading cause of dropping out of college is not that you're not prepared for college academically, it's because you can't afford it. So this is a really important book as well, and you're going to hear from Andrea again at the end of this program. Now for this book, I just want to draw two more attention, and then I really am going to get to Fred and Fred. But just really quick, there are, in the beginning here, there are 6 editors listed, and I just want to draw special attention to the role that Ian Galloway played in this book and getting it over the finish line. I think, you know, I was teasing about this, his son had like foot and mouth disease or something, and so he had one sick baby on one shoulder and the manuscript on the other. I mean, it was just like he literally carried this book over the finish line, and we can't thank him enough for that. And then, here. And the book is dedicated to Len Syme, who is a emeritus public health professor at UC Berkeley, who really got us down the path of thinking really holistically about what were the needs of people. He really was the one who kind of encapsulated this idea that your body is the sum record of your challenges and your opportunities. And even though he's been studying health for 60 years and knows all the models, knows all the science, he said what it all boils down to is whether or not someone has bright eyes. When he meets somebody and he sees bright eyes, he knows they're going to be healthy. He knows they're going to have a long life. And I just say the book is dedicated to him and to the idea that all children are born with bright eyes and that the ultimate outcome is keeping those eyes bright for a lifetime. So that's really what the book's about. Fred Ali, CEO of the Weingard Foundation. Fred Blackwell, CEO of the San Francisco Foundation. I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves and your organizations a little bit, and then we're going to get into what drew you to the idea of outcomes funding. Why did you think that was important? And what are you and your organizations doing to try to bring about an atmosphere, an ecosystem, an environment that allows that to happen? So who wants to go first?
Why don't you brag about the Warriors?
You know, I don't have to really mention any metaphors. Good afternoon. So just to tell you a little bit about kind of where we are first. I'm CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, Fred Blackwell. We're a community foundation serving the Bay Area. In the East Bay, we're in Alameda, Contra Costa County, and along the coast, we're in San Francisco, Marin, and San Mateo counties. We have been spending quite a bit of time over the last couple of years really thinking about what kind of impact that we want to have in the Bay Area. And In order to land on that, we've been doing a variety of things. So we've been engaging in community. We've been holding town hall meetings throughout the Bay Area. We've also been bringing in kind of thought leaders and practitioners and advocates into the foundation to give us feedback on the grant making that we've been doing in the past, and also helping us look at the horizon around where we should be focused. And we've also been looking at a lot of data. Long story short is we've come to the conclusion that really the issue of the day here in the region is that we have a tremendous amount of wealth and prosperity and opportunity that's being generated here in the Bay Area, and access to it is limited. And it's limited for far too many people based on where they live, what their family's economic status is, or something as basic and simple as what their race or ethnicity might be. And so we have chosen achieving a greater degree of racial and economic inclusion and equity as a North Star for our organization for the foreseeable future. And we see ourselves doing that in a combination of ways, with our grant making, through our relationships and our work with donors, and through our own civic leadership. And we think that an important part of every aspect of that work is about thinking about and understanding what kinds of outcomes and results that we want to achieve in each one of those areas. The last thing that I would say is that associated with that North Star, and this gets to something that Nancy was mentioning a little bit earlier, we too have come to the conclusion that the folks who are waging the people argument and the folks that are waging the place argument are right, both of them, and so that it's about people and place. But we also add another really, what I think is a really important aspect to this, which it is also about power. That it's not enough to have a bunch of great ideas and programs and policy interventions in the arenas of place and people if it's not connected to a constituency that is demanding change, and that we won't achieve the level of scale or sustainability without people being engaged as voters, being civically engaged, organized to demand the kinds of changes that we think are important. And so I'll start there, but I think that all those are really kind of important things to keep in mind.
Thank you, Fred. Freddie, tell us a little bit about the Weingart Foundation and how you got involved in all of this.
So yeah, good afternoon. It's great to be here, and especially on such a happy day for the Bay Area. I say as a Clipper fan. Someday. And a Cub fan, so I know there's hope. So the Winegard Foundation is a regional private foundation in Southern California. Some of you may be familiar with it. We are primarily a human services funder, although we also fund in the area of health and education. Probably over the last couple years, we have become most known for our work around organizational effectiveness. It starts with sort of a conviction on the part of our foundation that the funding model that we use to support nonprofit organizations in this country is, for the most part, broken. It does not provide nonprofit organizations, with the kind of support, the kind of flexible support that they really need to build effectiveness. We also are a foundation that works in the poorest areas, neighborhoods, communities in Southern California. And there are a lot of organizations that we support, that we want to support, providing critical services in those communities that simply are not being provided the kind of funding that they need to thrive and develop and produce the kind of outcomes that we're all looking for. So I would start by saying we are extremely interested in outcomes and seeing the funding we provide lead to outcomes. But I think before we embrace outcomes-oriented funding, we have to ask ourselves whether or not the nonprofit organizations we're supporting are really receiving the kind of support they need. They desperately need to develop the kind of effectiveness that's going to lead to the outcomes that we're all looking for. It has to start there.
Fred, you saw on that word cloud, I think it was funding and capacity were two very important concepts. Can you give us an example of a grantee or a group you've worked with where you sort of targeted that idea of capacity and brought them along? And
Yeah, so if you look at almost the entirety of our grant portfolio, they're all examples. Virtually everything we do is tied to unrestricted operating support funding, where we are identifying organizations and we think, David, maybe another way to answer your question, we think that the greatest impact that we can have as a funder is at the organizational level. Now, when I say this, at the organizational level in terms of allowing our grantees to use our dollars to build effectiveness, we have identified sort of 9 indicators of organizational effectiveness that we engage our grantees in a discussion around. Their things like board governance and engagement, staff and infrastructure, client and constituent engagement, fund development. I think I mentioned staff and infrastructure. We engage all of our grantees in a discussion around where they're at as an organization against all of those indicators. And we encourage them to use our funding to support those areas, to strengthen those areas where they perceive themselves to be weakest. And it's very, very interesting that we have tracked this now over a number of years. We have a learning and assessment framework that tracks grantee indicators against those 9 hallmarks. And what we're finding is that grantees are actually using our funding. And these are human service organizations that are facing incredible service demand, but they realize these dollars are very special, they're flexible, they're unrestricted. They're actually using our funding to shore up areas of capacity where they think they need the most strengthening. So.
yeah, when you think about BRC switching from being a hotel to ending homelessness, how do you find the capital to make that transition? It's hugely problematic, and unless you have funders like you who are making that long-term investment, or the Low-Income Investment Fund with Equity with a Twist, which is also doing something similar, or the work of the CDFI fund, of the part of the U.S. Treasury that's making investments in CDFIs to do that kind of transition. You'll see that essay in this book by Annie Donovan. Fred, I want to read an excerpt of your essay in the book by you and your co-author, Kate Howard, and get your response. Through flexible dollars, philanthropy has the ability to seed strategies, advance learning through evaluation, bring promising practices from the field, and apply the influence that keeps the needs of vulnerable communities as a top San Francisco priority. For its part, city government can use its most powerful tools, contracts potentially worth millions of dollars, to support scale and sustain programs that make a difference in the lives and economic prospects of vulnerable populations. For those of us concerned about race, place, and trauma in San Francisco, collective impact and outcomes-driven contracting is a powerful combination to address the shameful, wasteful paradox of a resource-rich, yet outcomes-poor city.
Did you write that?
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. I mean, there was some good editing on that, too, I'm just going to say, but tell us about that.
You know, there are a few concepts embedded in there, and I'll just say a couple of things in terms of background to give you some context for that. One is, you know, I've spent most of my career in local government, and what I find really fascinating about government, particularly in relationship to philanthropy, is that while in philanthropy our resources are substantial and flexible, they in kind of amount and size pale in comparison to what the government brings to the table. And so we in philanthropy, I think, are fooling ourselves if we think that we can get to the level of impact at a level of scale that matters without partnership with local government. Is just kind of the first kind of point of departure for me. The second point of departure for me, and some of the folks in the room know this about me, I grew up in a family of people that were very social justice oriented. And I often describe myself as the little kid in the back of the room with the coloring book at the community meeting, wondering why everybody was so upset and when we could go home. And being exposed to that early on did a couple of things. One is it gave me early on a really significant exposure and grounding about social justice and why it's important. But I was also exposed to kind of the moral imperative around results and outcomes. And what I mean by that is that, I went to the school that was founded and run by the Black Panther Party in Oakland. And there were a number of kind of groupings of people that were considered bad people, right? And chief among them was the person that was characterized as the poverty pimp. The person who received a salary, received power and influence because somebody else was poor, but they never did anything about it. And so for me, the push to really be focused in on results and outcomes comes from a place very early on in my life where I decided I never wanted to be characterized as a poverty pimp. And I think that, not that if you're not measuring results, you're a poverty pimp, but I think the thing that you can do to distinguish yourself from those folks is to produce outcomes for the people that you're working with. And I think that that's a really important concept as well. So that's the background. And I think the thing that I think is important here is that, yes, we do have in philanthropy the flexible dollars to be innovative, to think outside the box, and that aren't kind of accountable in the same way that local government is accountable. And I think with that comes the responsibility to partner with local government in ways that help them excel.
And I'd like to get into more detail about the Hope SF project, which is really kind of the subject of your chapter here. I do want to take a burst of questions from the audience, though. So I'd like you to sort of, if you could just raise your hand, and we have people running microphones, yeah? And while you're getting set up for that and raising your hand and getting a microphone, I do want to just highlight one oversight. This What It's Worth book was edited on our staff by Laura Choi, who is the microphone over here, and another superstar on our staff. It's funny. We were in New York City, and I see some hands up, so we can go get those microphones to them. And a Harvard professor came up to me afterwards and said, I teach a course on community development, and I just use your 3 and now 4 books as the reading list for the entire course. So I want to thank the 3 editors that are on our staff here that were part of making that happen. That was really impressive. So what I'd like to do is I want to be very quick about this. So like 30 seconds maybe. Just tell us who you are, your name, your organization, ask a very quick question, and then we're going to go to the next one. They are not going to answer now. We're going to take a bunch, and then we'll tackle them in sequence. So back there, Naomi.
Okay. Hello, I'm, excuse me, Mara Sash, Change Lab Solutions, and Fred Blackwell. The partnership with government, the question I have is, what's the public policy context that these social change, the outcome-oriented must be placed within to ultimately be successful? If we have broken communities and broken public policies, all the better services in the world won't reach the end we need. Mm-hmm. What's your thought about that?
Great, thanks, Maris. Next one.
Jed Emerson, self. So in 1989, 1990, the Rensselaer Institute in upstate New York published a book called Outcome Funding that was very provocative and created all kinds of discussion in the philanthropic community. And I remember sitting in meetings at the San Francisco Foundation hearing almost verbatim this same conversation. So my question is, what is wrong with philanthropy that they can't get out of their own way to do something about this issue?
We have another one here.
Mickey Levitan, Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. This question for Fred Ali. If you guys give unrestricted support to these organizations, what prevents them from using funds primarily for program expenditures and not really committing to the long-term organizational development needs that you're targeting?
So let's hold those 3, and then keep on raising your hands. You can get distribute the mics to the next 2 people. We had Darren Walker on the stage in New York. He's the CEO of the Ford Foundation, and I love his quote. He says, to your point, Jed Emerson, he says, "The moral arc of the universe is long and bends towards justice, but not in 3-year funding cycles." Fred, do you want to take that last question first?
Yeah, it's a great question. We get asked the question a lot. First of all, I want to be clear that the funding, that our funding is truly unrestricted. But it comes through a rather long due diligence process and a relationship building process with our grantees in Southern California. Most of these grantees we've had long-standing relationships with. And organizations during that due diligence process do identify areas of capacity needs, and they identify as part of the request process how they would like to address those needs. So when I answer this question, I always tell the story that in the aftermath of the 08-09 financial crisis, what we saw is organizations actually using our dollars, as you might expect, and actually trying to fill programmatic needs. And we spent a lot of time talking to our grantees about that and the peril of not paying attention to their capacity needs. And around 2010, we started seeing a switch, and that switch continues where these organizations are actually, and we were starting to develop a fair amount of data that supports this. The organizations are, in fact, realizing that, as I said earlier, these are flexible special dollars, and they are addressing capacity needs. There is a learning and assessment framework, so there is a bit of accountability that our grantees have to pay attention to, but it's also a long-term process. So I think part of this comes to also trusting your grantees to do what is in their best interest, and by and large, that's what we see our grantees doing.
Thanks, Fred Ali. Fred Blackwell, do you want to tackle either one?
The other two? Sure. One on the policy context. I think that is a really good point, and I'll try to be succinct here, but there are about 3 or 4 points that come to mind when you talk about that. I think one is the relationship between philanthropy and local government, or government at any level, has to move beyond the transaction. It can't just be about supplanting public dollars or partnering as an investment partner in a particular program. I think that there is a responsibility to both be an investment partner, but also a partner in the aspect of the work that is about strategy and defining what the end goal is. So part of that also means, and it also means for us, at any given moment, the mayor here or the mayor in Oakland will be simultaneously happy to be partnering with the San Francisco Foundation on a particular project, but also frustrated with the San Francisco Foundation because we are funding advocacy and organizing that's a thorn in their side, that's pushing for systems changes and policy changes that the department heads or the elected officials aren't necessarily happy to see coming. And so I think you just have to be prepared for the multiple dimensions of the relationship. And you referred to Hope SF, and so I think another aspect of this is that there have to be conversations about values and principles as well. And the reason I bring up Hope SF as an example of that is because that is not just about the revitalization of public housing and the physical revitalization, but it is about severely minimizing the displacement and focusing just as much on the outcomes for the kids and families that are living in public housing as it is around the public housing itself. And we only got there through a conversation about values and principles and what we were trying to achieve together. Jed, to your point, I think the problem about philanthropy is that when you've seen one philanthropic institution, you've seen just one philanthropic institution. Each one has its own culture. Each one has its own boards of director. Each one has their own orientation to how important outcomes might be versus outputs, versus a focus on race, versus a focus on place, versus a focus on people. So you can find, I think, a cluster of philanthropic institutions that have been working on this stuff since they talked about it back in the early 90s at the San Francisco Foundation and have made tremendous progress. And I want to acknowledge those folks, although I'm not sure I could list who they are. But there are others who are just getting into it and others who don't really care to be involved in the conversation or think it's that important. And so I think part of the answer to your question is that there's just too much diversity in terms of perspective, approach, governance, leadership within philanthropy for us all to move in any one direction at the same time.
Fred, I'm going to go. We'll take two last questions, so whoever has those microphones, get ready, but not right now. Can you just give us 2 minutes on Hope SF and the Phoenix Partnership and what you're shooting for?
Yeah, so I kind of gave you a little bit of 2 minutes on Hope SF. It is focused in on 4 public housing sites in the city and county of San Francisco, 5,000 families that live in those sites. It's about revitalizing the public housing. It's about improving the way that the city and county of San Francisco responds to those 5,000 families in ways that produce better outcomes for those families as well. What we have done a very good job of up until this point is really advancing the physical revitalization. We've done a good job of getting the right folks around the table to have the right conversations and to get local government more responsive from a service point of view. But what we haven't done is get these families on a different economic trajectory. And so the Phoenix Project is really about asking the question, how do we connect these families to the San Francisco economy and the regional economy in ways that don't require them to need public housing? And also to get to the outcome, which is we never really envisioned this being about folks being in new public housing but still being unable to make ends meet. We want to get folks on firmer financial ground. And so the Phoenix Project is really about that, partnering with local community-based organizations that have tentacles and credibility in the community and working with them in partnership to figure out how we can put in place a system that is working different for them and connect them to the economy, and to do that in ways that are funded in a performance-oriented way.
Fantastic. Thanks, Fred. Okay, who has a microphone? Okay, 30 seconds.
Hi, my name is Carrie Rice. I'm an independent development consultant for nonprofits. I've received assurances from many foundations in San Francisco and in the Bay Area that they're prepared for rapid responses as a result of a minor event that happened in November that changed a lot of our funding. And I'm curious how you're planning to measure outcomes when you have to deal with something in a rapid response way like we are having to do right now.
Great, thank you. And the last question?
Yes, my name is Valerie Tulielewa, and thank you, Mr. Blackwell, for touching upon it. But I see that the outcomes based results are very, very important, but in my opinion, they're not the end of all to end the disparities and to end poverty. So I think that what I'm asking is, can we go further up the stream to actually find the root causes of poverty and lack of education, which then becomes a systems and institution change? And is that analysis part of what you're getting to as you do these outcomes and results practices? Thank you.
Great. Do you want to take that first one?
Yeah, in terms of, we are, I'm sorry, over here. We're also engaged in a fair amount of rapid response grant making right now. And, you know, to be clear, I think you have to be, you have to be realistic in terms of what you're trying to measure. We are providing rapid response grants primarily around immigration issues. The purpose of most of those grants is trying to maintain staff capacity or add staff capacity to address an existential problem. And we're not going to ask for a lot of outcome data for a $25,000 or $30,000 grant with an organization that we know well that is going to apply those funds probably in the way that they were intended. So I think part of this is also being balanced in terms of the evaluation work that you're expecting.
Yeah, I will add, and this is going to be a complicated answer, but I think that this stuff is not simple, so I'm just going to go ahead and provide a complicated answer to this. And I think it relates both to the rapid response question and the get further upstream question. it is important, I think, and we think at the foundation, to track outcomes at the grant level. However, what we are really seeking is population level change. And that's a complicated endeavor because population level change does not occur one $25,000, $50,000, $100,000, even $500,000 grant at a time. What produces population level change is when people are thinking about this work differently, people are messaging this, when you are impacting the narrative, when you are simultaneously focused in on program delivery that is solid, but also focused in on systems change and policy and advocacy, and when you are doing that not only in the nonprofit sector, but doing that across the nonprofit sector, the public sector, and the corporate sector, particularly when we're talking about issues around equity. And so while I think that, again, it's important for us to get down into the weeds around has Grant X produced what we thought it would produce from an outcome point of view, that is insufficient in terms of measuring the impact of our work. And we have to have goals that are ambitious enough to bring all the partners that I named to the table. My mother has told me on a number of occasions, if you are attacking a complex problem like this and have come to the conclusion that you have developed a solution that only involves you, you have either misidentified the problem or have the wrong solution. And so we've got to be thinking about this stuff in ways that approach this stuff in partnership and really bring in the notion of collective impact. And that's, I think, what we have to be measuring, and it's probably more important for us to measure that than the individual grant that we're making as an institution.
That's really helpful, Fred. But I want to give you two the last word. We're out of time. And I'm going to give Fred Ali 2 minutes, and Fred, I'm going to borrow a minute from your last answer because that was so good, and give you 1 minute to end us off. So, Fred?
Yeah, I actually wanted to go back to Jed's question because I think it's an important question, the idea of philanthropy not being able to get out of its own way in regard to this. I mean, that's, as a frequent critic of philanthropy, it's going to be difficult for me to completely disagree with this. This is sort of tough work, to put it mildly, and it's just not about making grants. It's being a participant in, we have an equity agenda as well in Southern California, so it goes beyond simply making grants, but it also includes being a participant at public policy tables. It includes being a participant in advocacy, supporting organizations that are involved in advocacy and organizing work. And it also includes the ability to bring in staff into the organization that actually has real life familiarity with the issues that we're trying to address. And quite frankly, a lot of organizations simply see this work as being the complexity of this work being a little bit more than they want to take on, and so they don't take on the challenge. But I'm hopeful, though, because I see more and more colleagues in philanthropy that are willing to take a more holistic and comprehensive view. And, I'm hopeful for the future.
I'll be brief. We cannot ask or expect folks to do things that we're not willing to do ourselves. And so if we are talking about trying to, and specifically, advance equity, I'm not supposed to be asking other folks what they're doing with their board, who's leading their organizations, what kind of outcomes they're producing, if I'm not prepared to answer that question for my institution. And so one of the things that we're doing is training everybody at the San Francisco Foundation on results-based accountability, whether you work at the front desk or you're a program officer. And we are, for the first time, establishing a position within the organization that is focused in on data learning and evaluation so that we can be as well-versed on this stuff as the folks that we're asking to do it themselves.
Thanks so much. Please join me in thanking the panel.